It's a martyrdom, like the 7 Maccabean brothers. It's a martyrdom. Oh no, it's also a sacrifice. No, it's not. Why isn't it? Because it's taking place outside the city, far from the temple. Where are the altars? Where are the priests? No temple, no altar, no priests, no sacrifice. So, we have to ask ourselves the question, how did Christians ever come to draw the conclusion that Calvary is in fact a sacrifice and not just an execution or maybe a martyrdom? Guess who introduced that teaching? St. Paul. Guess how he introduced that teaching? Go back to 1 Corinthians 5. We find in the early 50s the gift of grace that revealed to Paul something that Saul never saw, nor Scott. I never saw it either. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, he writes, "For Christ our Paschal Lamb, for Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Let us therefore" what? Believe in his death and resurrection, and that's all we need to do. And once we believe, we're saved, and once saved, always saved. It doesn't matter what we do. I mean, these are words that Paul could have written. He just never did. But what does he write? Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Let us therefore keep the feast. Let us therefore celebrate the festival. And in the Greek, the verb for keeping or celebrating is in the imperative. It's not an option. What festival is he talking about? He goes on to talk about the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. It's the festival of unleavened bread that immediately followed the Passover. And what's he go on to describe for us in the next several chapters? The Eucharist. This is how Paul came to discover that the cross is more than an execution, it's more than a martyrdom. It is a sacrifice. And the only way you can understand what happened to Jesus on Calvary is if you rewind the tape and return to the upper room. Why? Because what was Jesus doing in the upper room? He wasn't simply celebrating the old Passover. He was fulfilling it as the Lamb of God, as the firstborn son. But he wasn't simply fulfilling the old, he was ratifying the new Passover, which the early church calls the what? The Eucharist. By saying, this bread is my body, which is given for you, this cup is the blood of the new covenant, that's sacrificial terminology. When you separate your body from your blood, what have you begun to do? You've begun to give your life as a gift of love. And in that setting he says, no man has the power to take my life from me. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it back up again. And if the soldiers had overheard that remark, I think they would have begged to differ. They would have said, excuse me, Rabbi, with all due respect, we do have the power to take your life. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing shortly when we follow our orders. Except for one thing. Before they ever could lay their hands upon him, he laid his hands upon bread, turned it into his body, and then the chalice into his blood. Before they could take his life from him and kill him, he had already freely offered his life as a gift of love, transforming death into a prayer, into a sacrifice. Do this in remembrance of me is the technical terminology, anamnesis in the Greek, zikaron in the Hebrew, for offering a memorial sacrifice. It is the Eucharist that illuminates Calvary and suddenly sheds divine light upon his suffering and says, this is not just an execution or a martyrdom. What began in the upper room didn't end there. It didn't end until he gave his body and poured out his blood. The Eucharist alone explains the sacrificial action of Jesus on the cross, but the cross shows us this is more than religious rhetoric. This is more than just a spicy homily in the context of celebrating the Passover. What he said and what he did are one and the same. The Eucharist is a sacrifice that is consummated on Calvary. Calvary is not an execution, but the completion of the new Passover. Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore what? Just simply believe? Let us keep the feast. And so he goes on to explain the Eucharist. This is something that is a revelation from God, but this is something that also fits with our own experience. Because, you know, it's so often the case that certain preachers make it seem as though Jesus on the cross suffered so much agony that it's the pain and suffering that saved us. Well, that's not entirely accurate. As St. Thomas Aquinas teaches, he reminds us that it's not how much Jesus suffered on the cross that redeems us from sin. It's how much he loves. God isn't just looking for pain and suffering. God is looking for love. It's how much he loved us. That's what transformed the suffering into sacrifice. We all know this from experience as well. Because suffering without love is unendurable. Have you ever had to suffer without any love? You're already there at the point of despair. Suffering without love is unendurable. But love without suffering is unimaginable. It's impossible. Again, as Pope Benedict reminds us, love expresses itself in the gift of self, through sacrifice, through suffering. You know, if a guy tells a girl in the back seat, "I love you," she had better ask herself one question real quick: does he love me, or does he just love the way I'm making him feel? In which case, who does he really love? Himself, and he's just using me. Sacrifice is the proof of love. But what's the proof of sacrifice? Suffering for your beloved. Suffering is what turns love into more than words. But love is what transforms suffering into a holy sacrifice. And where do we find the love of Christ? In the Holy Eucharist. Nobody's taking my life, I am giving it. The love that is expressed in the Eucharist is embodied in the suffering and the agony on the cross. But love is what transforms suffering into a holy sacrifice. So that Jesus is doing with his human nature what God does from all eternity in his divinity. The supremacy of God is not his capacity to dominate us, coerce us, but it consists of a love that is life-giving without any limitation. And that's what Christ reveals to us on the cross, and that's what the Spirit reproduces in us as well. I want to draw some conclusions now. Because once we understand the inner logic of the cross, once we understand the word, the logos of the cross, we can understand why Paul concludes the way he does. First, in Philippians